Jennie Joseph presents The Hands That Caught Us, a legacy podcast series with our midwife elders, an archival offering through the Perinatal Pause Podcast with Jennie Joseph, where we rest, reclaim, and remember one story at a time. Welcome to The Hands That Caught Us, a sacred series within the Perinatal Pause Podcast with Jennie Joseph. In each episode, we sit in reverence with our elder midwives, keepers of ancestral knowledge, community healers, and witnesses to the sacred continuum of life. These conversations are a pause, a restoration, and a reclaiming of our birthright. These are the stories that built us, and these are the stories that sustain us.
Well, hello. It is my distinct pleasure and the honor of inviting and welcoming Mama Sarahn Henderson, Grand Midwife, to the podcast today. Thank you, Sarahn. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Jennie. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm excited what you're doing. I think what you're doing is important. You're important, and documenting the importance of all the grand midwives that are still here with us. It's important. So thank you for thinking to include me in this as well.
Absolutely. It's been such a journey. You will know I got to the States in 1989, so I've only been here, well, actually half of my life. But what has been, this journey has been so amazing in terms of there's still so much more to know and understand about midwifery from the United States perspective. And I learned everything I know thus far from people like you who shared so generously and demonstrated so authentically how you have been practicing, how you have been grounded in midwifery throughout your career, and how you pick that up from the elders, from the ancestor midwives. And this is what informed my midwifery, having been grown and trained as an institutional midwife in a London hospital before I arrived in the States. Can you share a little bit about how did you get to midwifery? Where and how did that begin for you? And how that has really formed who you are to this day as a midwife?
Yeah, because I came to Atlanta in 1975, pursuing a degree which I did get in education, and being a midwife was the furthest thing from my mind. I had heard my mother talk about midwives, in the past, because she was born at home in Savannah, with a midwife, but there was no conversations that were being had when I was coming into those early childbearing years. And so I began working at a natural food store the second year that I was here. I learned about it the first year. I was introduced to it. And then the second year, that's when my life began to transform. And so the first thing was that I wanted to change my diet over, because I knew that me growing up and having menstrual cramps, bad menstrual cramps, had something to do with diet. When I came here and lived on my own and shopped my own food and cooked my own food, and the cramping started subsiding. So I took an interest in this health food store. And in this health food store that year, we would have travelers from out of state, as well as a few people here who were revolutionary kind of people, and listening to their conversations, listening to the women talk about how they were supporting each other in childbirth, just as friends, not as midwives. They just supporting their sisters, that was kind of intriguing. At that time, I was also, my husband and I don't want to say that we were courting or anything, but we were working at the same health food store, and we were developing values inside of ourselves that we wanted to instill as part of our lifestyles. We weren't thinking about being married at the time, but he wanted that for his own lifestyle. I wanted it for my lifestyle. And then, skipping stepping stones and whatnot, we eventually got married. and still embracing a more holistic type of lifestyle. When we conceived, having our baby at home just seemed like the natural thing to do. We knew that there were hospitals in Atlanta, all around Atlanta, all around us. But I wasn't afraid of the idea, and I wasn't really hearing the fear that you hear a lot these days, because still at that time in the 70s, midwives were still practicing, especially in the rural areas. Little did I know then, okay?
Mhm.
And so anyways, we went on to have our baby at home, and little did I know that my midwife was also expecting at the time. As time went forward, I was invited to go to attend her birth as a support person. She had a midwife already, and so I went, and it just felt like a natural space for me to be in. I didn't know what to do, so I was just being intuitive and massaging her, when she was having her surgeries and whatnot. And it was that night after her baby was born that she saw something in me. She felt something in me. She felt something in my hands. And she invited me to midwifery if I wanted my hands to be trained. And so I was like, okay, so let me run it by my family, And so I ran it by my mother. She was good about it. My grandmother, who birthed my mother at home, and how she was born at home too. And my husband, he was definitely in alignment with it. And so maybe about 6 months after she gave birth to her baby, then she got back into servicing families, and she contacted me and asked me if I was ready. So I told her, yeah. And that was in 1980. And yeah, and
The
I
rest is
apprenticed at that time. Um, I guess women could have done like yourself, gone to school, because Emory was offering a midwifery program
Mhm.
then. They're not offering it now. But if you weren't going the nurse midwifery route, if you weren't answering the call through that route, then you went into midwifery through the apprenticeship model. Because at that time we didn't have computers, and
Right.
there was no schools like the Common Sense Midwifery School that was around where you can go
Okay.
get your learning, your education. You had to apprentice with somebody that was experienced. And so that's what I did. I went under her wings for about 4.5, 5 years, and just traveled with her to birth, to birth, set up prenatal clinics here in
Mm.
Atlanta, and we started childbirth classes. We grew a collective of about 5 women, and little did we know we were planting seeds, you know, planting seeds for the future, planting seeds for the here and the now. Because now
Right.
we're talking about 45 years later. And
45 years.
mhm.
45 years. How many babies would you say through the course of those 45 years that you've supported? How many families?
I would say that I've caught probably like 1,000, but with some of those babies, they're siblings too.
Hmm.
So it's not
Right.
just how many
Right.
families, but
Yes.
I'm like
Her
I'm
family. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. It
And
seems everybody, the calling is different, but the calling is strong and it seems permanent. It seems like once you're called and once you begin, that's it.
well, there are women that do feel like they are called. I would say that I was called because it wasn't something that I pursued. I
Hmm.
came here to go to school, and that's what I did, and started a family, and boom, I'm starting, in this career. And so women, I think many women are called. I think fewer choose, because it is a responsibility being at that gate between here and there, you know and but then, so you have those women who are in place because they know that they can stand there at that gate and help usher life in to
Hmm.
earth side. But then you also have those women that just they come into pregnancy trusting their bodies.
Right.
They're
That's
already
an important
determined
one.
what they want.
They seem to have this knowing about them
Mm-hmm.
that is like, especially when you see young ones like that, it always has intrigued me. How did you know this? How did you get that? Where did you find that confidence in yourself and your body?
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
wasn't my experience, but I've witnessed it over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And so you have that population of women that's going to keep midwifery thriving,
Yes,
you
yes,
know?
yes, absolutely. Well, you've had the unique opportunity to have learned in the purest of apprenticeship models from the ultimate teacher of, traditional ancestral midwifery, right? The organic midwifery that grew from the legacy of the African midwives, the enslaved women who delivered America, right? And even through Jim Crow, particularly in the South, we know that it was the Black midwives who were continuing that tradition, all of the empirical knowledge that they gained through those years of enslavement were passed on through and down. And such that even towards the 70s, like you said, those midwives that were still practicing had so many of those elements that they knew inherently and were able to also pass on. Can you share a little bit more about how the experience of working with a traditional midwife who was in her craft, in her power, answering the call of the community, because it was the community that supported those midwives, that chose those midwives, acknowledged that, yes, this is the one, this is who I trust. You had that direct connection as you grew into midwifery.
Yeah, so my introduction into midwifery, uh, a, s- um, a grounding force of the introduction of midwifery to me did come from my mentor, Mama Nasra, who
Yes.
was not one that went to school either to become a midwife. And she did not train under anybody either. She was anointed. That's the best way that I can say.
Yes.
She was anointed. And in that anointment, as the Ifa people of Yoruba will call Ashe, she had the Ashe.
Mm.
Nobody could take that Ashe, meaning that you knew that her hands were blessed by the Creator. You knew that the what it was that she brought with her to birth was like she was almost being in a humanistic way, but also spirit channeling through her. And so my foundation was like a spiritual foundation into midwifery. I once we started to run a prenatal clinic for the mothers who we were serving, um, we were noticing that these same women were going to the community clinics to get their labs and see the doctor and whatnot. And they would sometimes come back questioning us about what was being said in their visit with their doctor, things that kind of went over their head, and they want to bring it back to us so that we can maybe interpret things for them. And so it was then that I didn't want to clone myself. You can't clone yourself
No.
of somebody else. And I
Right.
knew I couldn't clone myself as Mama Nasra, and I didn't want to clone myself as not Mama Nasra. I wanted to have a East meets the West type of
Right.
philosophy and energy about myself. And so I felt like it would behoove me, it would behoove us to learn certain things so that when people came to us and they were asking questions, we could answer them, like lab results, for instance. And so
Yeah.
during that same time, then there were other women in Atlanta who were also answering the call, whether they were white, whether they're black, or whether they were Hispanic. and we all formed together to create an alliance. We called ourselves the Southern Alliance of Midwives. And it was basically each one teach one. And it had like some spiritual stuff with it too. You know, we'd do it around a campfire in the evening time and just talk about our birth experiences, you know, the people who we were working with. And what would you do in that situation?
Right.
What we would call today peer review, you know?
Right. Sarahn, what year was that? When was that formed, the Southern Alliance, did you say?
80s, 1980s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you found each other, came together, and essentially emulated what had been going on for centuries,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And we were doing that knowing that we had a history. It's kind of like this, Jenny. It's kind of like this. It's like being born here in the United States after so many generations of our foremothers and forefathers being born here, and the what's the right word? The evils of enslavement, where they would break families up and mothers and their children and husbands and wives, and no proper record keeping, you know. So unlike you, British born Africans, whether you come from Jamaica or Grenada or Trinidad, you all still know your
That's right.
roots,
Mm-hmm.
whereas we've lost our roots. And it's kind of like that's how it was with midwifery. I knew we had a history.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was born at home, you know, and her mother, and so on and so forth, and my father. My mother's from Savannah, my father's from Alabama. So I knew we had a history, you know, because the oral history would be,
That's right.
you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so over the years, Nasra and I, we just grew to be really good friends. And we were road dogs together. A lot of our road dog experiences were going down to meet granny midwives. And that was after we realized that they were here and they were still alive.
Right?
We can meet them and hear their stories as opposed to hearing their stories being miswritten by other
Or
people
even not told.
or not told. And that's the reason why I'm liking what you're doing, is because that whole combination of it not being told, of it being erased, that gives space for other people to make up our history.
That's right.
And what we're
That's
doing,
right.
we're telling our history, you know?
The uniqueness, I think, again, of having lived experience, having real time with, you know, the authentic midwifery that got us through that practically century after, you know, Reconstruction, before the mass movement into hospital. Like, you know, it seems always incredulous to me whenever I say something, you know, in general, you know, society along the lines of everybody was born at home in America until just the other day. And they're like, you know, what are you saying? Well, that's all everybody had. There was a home birth. And, you know, if you had a physician, they might come to you, but certainly the midwives did everything for everybody. So the movement into hospital, the forced movement into hospital, and segregated hospitals at that, seems to match the timing of the complete devastation for Black communities, and I would say indigenous communities, Native communities as well, who were forced out of their usual traditional way of being supported through pregnancy and birth, and forced into these institutions that had started out with, we don't give a care, and have to this day, it seems, continued. As we face down this so-called crisis of Black maternal health, morbidity, and mortality in the United States, where we lag dead last behind any developed nation. There's a direct correlation between the history and the story of midwifery in the United States and our current so-called crisis. And it seems like it began as folk were moved out of the home environment, and the purposeful eradication of the midwives began as well.
Yeah, that's what Shafia, our sister Shafia Monroe, calls this the darkest day of midwifery's history.
Indeed, indeed. And it's almost to a level of, when you put all the missing pieces together and you see the wickedness of the purposeful, there was no mistake. This was for capitalism. This was for power. This was from straight racism. This was discrimination on class, poverty, you name it. All of the things played into what happened and how we are here and how we are today. You said that in 1970s, you had access to midwifery because you knew about it. You were able to find your midwife, and that the midwives were still there. And considering the amount of work it took to eradicate them, there were so many that hung on and continued on into the 80s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
I know
That's
you're a
right.
historian as well. Share a little bit about what you've learned and what you've shared with us all along the way about the history of Georgia specifically, but the Southern United States.
Yeah, because the Southern United States has similar stories.
Mm-hmm.
The stories are pretty similar. And so it wasn't until I had Tanya. So it wasn't until 1982, so 2 years later after I started, that I happened to see somehow or other all my babies came to the Atlanta library. And a fellow midwife called me up and said, I think you want to see this.
And this is the film, a documentary film.
This is a documentary film that was actually filmed here in Georgia.
Yes.
It's filmed here in Georgia in 1952 as a teaching aid.
There you
The
go.
health department had hired George Stoney from New York to come down and to produce and direct a teaching film to teach the importance of hygiene to the granny midwives in the health departments, were all the health departments. And so, anyways, I went, and that's when I said,
Yeah.
that's the link.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I need to see. I can take it from here. And I just sat there on the edge of my seat and just watched Miss Mary Cooley, doing her thing, and with the two mothers. And I knew that they're in Albany, and I was getting all my little facts together. Her name was Mary Cooley. Okay, good. I came home, and by this time it's late. It's probably at least 10 o'clock at night. But I came home and I contacted the main hospital in Albany. And then I had that person, the switchboard person, to connect me to labor and delivery. So then somebody from labor and delivery answered the phone. And I said, hi, my name is Sarahn Henderson, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And I just saw a documentary about a midwife named Miss Mary Cooley. Have you ever heard of Miss Mary Cooley? And she busted out laughing. She says, of course, everybody's heard of Miss Mary Cooley. She delivered about everybody here. And so I told her that I was interested in gathering the history of Georgia's midwifery, specifically Black midwifery. And so she connected the dot to the lady in the health department in Albany. That lady connected the dot to somebody in the health department here in Atlanta. That lady told me all the information that you want to know about Georgia from the time that Oglethorpe arrived is at the archives. I was like, okay, cool. And then that's when my research began. And so I've spent days and days and hours when I dropped my kids off at school just doing research through their vaults of boxes. And there was just boxes and boxes of stuff, Jenny, just boxes of pictures, birth certificates, midwives, permits, the exams that they needed to study by, that they used, all that kind of stuff was birth records, all that kind of stuff was in there. And out of that, I was able to compile a list of granny midwives that I thought would still be alive based on their birth year. And so then I wrote down all their names, all their addresses and their phone numbers and their age and the probable age at this point. And then I just spent time at that, calling people one by one, introducing myself. Eventually, Nasra and I spent about 5 years on the road going to rural Georgia because, in the city, midwife home birthing was becoming more trendy now. We're talking about like in the 30s. More women were now having their babies in the hospital. Black women felt like, white women can have their babies in the hospital. Then I must be moving up and I'm having my baby in the hospital as well, And so women were starting to have their babies in the hospital, like right around the time where a lot of these midwives that were still living, the ones that we were talking to, they were in the midst of that transition.
Yes.
They were seeing they were seeing their decline of mothers coming to them and the increase of women having their babies, in the hospital. And so I got to hear firsthand their disappointments, their disappointments in being forced to retire. The health departments will put stipulations on them like, if you did not deliver 12 babies in a year, like one birth a year, a month, then you were deemed not necessary. And then they would not renew their licenses for the next year. And so sometimes they would come to the health department for their monthly meetings to get their bags inspected and get refilled and whatnot. And some of them would come back and they would find out that their services were no longer needed according to, the health department. But then other stories were just really enlightening to hear, So I think about the strength in women. I think about the courage. The thing that was also inspiring about these granny midwives, which we eventually retermed to grand midwives when we eventually had a conference here in Atlanta in the 80s. They liked that name. Grand is like grandeur. I mean, they were the pillars. They were one of the pillars in the community.
That's right.
And then all of a sudden they didn't become necessary. Now, today, some of them are outlaws. But anyways, was that because they had no choice but to serve their communities, they had to deliver twin babies and they had to deliver breech babies. That was just the variation of the norm for them.
Well, and it is literally the variation of the norm because it's what happens, organically. This is the nature of childbearing, right? And has always been. This is not new.
That's right.
You think about all the things that come with maternity or obstetrics. Stuff happens of which we have no power or control. But those who are willing, able, and interested in always centering mama baby, always centering community mores, always centering humanity, figure out how to meet whatever obstetrics brings without causing harm. And I think that piece alone is, one of the areas where midwifery, because it holds that always, doesn't matter what entry route you have into midwifery, traditional, apprenticeship, classroom, nursing, whatever it is that gets you to being in that space that you end up calling yourself a midwife, the one thing that is absolutely paramount and is absolutely held is that you center the birthing person. You center their family. You center their community. You center their requests. You center their humanity. that goes with midwifery and it cannot be removed. And I think the struggle now, as we are in this era of midwifery in the United States, at least, is that whatever type of midwife you are hard put to be able to be in your fully expressed self because of all these constraints, whether they are from a racial space, a power space, resource space, recognition, acknowledgement, all the things are coming against you being able to hold that person centered safely, culturally. Sarahn, how do we get our younguns, our young midwives, our baby midwives, our wannabe midwives, how do we get to hand over and you know, to reach back while they're coming up as we start making our moves towards moving on, right? As we age, as we become the hope for ancestors. We're standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, but how do we help this next generation as they grow into the work, grow into the calling? How do we help them? What can we share with them to help them on this journey?
Well, one thing for sure is to teach them patience. Teach them patience. I find that, and I find that quite a number of wannabe midwives came to me and they were just now starting their family, and then they found themselves torn between family, children, and some of those same people. I tell them, if you're called, you're called. It doesn't mean that you have to do it right this very minute.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, do something that's going to lend towards your knowledge, your wisdom, your education.
Yeah.
Okay. And when the time is right, you'll know that it's right. And then you can pursue it in a more steady type of way. Women, they have to have support. If they're married, they need to have a partner that's going to support them. It's not going to trip when they leave out at 2 o'clock in the morning and not back home until 2 o'clock the next morning. If they're going to do this and they have little children, then they have to to mm, they have to be they have to be organized and have child care in place as well. Because when you look at some of the ancestral images and pictures of graduating classes of midwives from back in the day, a lot of them are grandmother ages. Yes, you might see a few sprinkles of some young faces that was in that photograph, but most of them were grandmother ages. They had raised their children. They were out the house raising their own children. Now the grand midwife had all of her time to focus on centering the families that she was nurturing. And it's hard to center a family as a young midwife when you're still trying to center your own family.
Right. And it's such a detriment when you can't center your own family because now you get to that place of being a little disingenuous, right? I can speak to this because I had a wretched time. I made many mistakes along the way. I only had one child, but it didn't matter because he turned to me when he was 18 and told me, he said, "Mommy, you were never there for me." And I couldn't argue with him. One child, one. And, midwifery consumed me. I was so passionate. I was so engaged and involved that my kid felt the neglect. He said, everybody else's family comes first. If I had to do it over again, I would have been able to think that through differently because you can't undo it. And if we are about family, if we're about centering the needs of the family, then we also have to be able to figure out how do we mirror that and have that be real and authentic for ourselves as well.
I really feel like I've been blessed, Jennie. God redirected my focus. My focus was in education. And although 75% of midwifery is education, you know.
Mm.
I was not in the classroom, in the public school classroom, like the other women and men in my family. There were plenty of times along the years where I second guessed myself, where I would ask God, am I doing the right thing? You know, should I be doing something different? You know, as our family is growing and growing, eventually we had 7 people in our family, 5 children and the 2 of us. And you know, midwifery is not really one of those kind of careers where you can bank on making $1 million. And so,
There
but
you
I
go.
still, yeah, but I needed to help supplement my husband with his income and whatnot. But we were able to do it, and I'm just really grateful when I listen to some of the teachers that are in the school classrooms and listen to their stories that they're sharing. They don't sound like the stories that my mother would share when she was a teacher. I'm kind of glad that I'm not in the classroom, you know, these days. And I like what anchored me into really staying into this was I want getting into this was I felt so empowered by it because hardly anybody else was doing home births. Everybody was going to the hospital. That was the norm. And people were like, what? Well, what about the pain? Well, what if, you know, all those things. And again, I stand on the shoulders of my mother and grandmothers who also did it. And so I felt empowered, not in the loose sense, but in the sense that I did it. I accomplished something that somebody else said I couldn't do. I had a doctor before I landed on Mama Nasra. I did have a doctor. I chose a West African doctor, thinking that, oh, great, he's from Africa. He's gonna be all about supporting me with a home birth. Nah,
Nope. Nope.
no way. And somewhere like around my 7th or 8th month, I was just telling my mother this last night. The first thing he did was he told me that he wanted me to start prepping myself for a C-section because my husband, tall, big boned, me short, small bone. And so I carried large. He didn't have confidence in me being able
Right.
to push my baby out. And I did. And I wasn't going to be the first person in our family to have a C-section. The second thing that he did was when I went to my prenatal visit, he would never talk to me. You know, everything's good. We'll see you next time. There was no dialogue. There was no explanations of anything that he was doing. So one day I was in his office and he stepped out the office and I picked up my folder. He might consider it his folder, but it's me in there. And I was trying to read his notes. And then he came in there and he snatched it out of my hand as if my prenatal care was his secret.
There you go.
And that's when I decided to jump off the fence and go find my midwife, you know, and I never
It's just,
came back.
and considering how long ago that was, in terms of, how things are now. We talk to young people about, if you're not comfortable with your doctor, change. If you don't feel that your questions are being heard or answered, then you fight, stand up for yourself, advocate. We've got a work on our hands to support the general public, whichever choice they've made, but in getting the safest pathway through that choice. And these ways of being are still in place to this day. Essentially, obstetrics hasn't changed because American obstetrics built on the institution and built on the structure of the institutions hasn't had to change. We've had so many crises through the decades. Oh, we're doing too many C-sections, we should stop. Yeah, right. Oh, we're doing too many inductions, we should stop. Oh, yeah. Oh, we're doing this and we're doing that. The various so-called, crises and oh, this is something that needs to be addressed. They wax and they wane. We really don't change much of anything. And, it's sad when we have to have the conversations, which is, what's a midwife? Or what's the difference between a midwife and a doula? These are our modern day conversations around something that has been the exact same thing from day one, right? You speak to how you had that resilience, that empowerment, that autonomy, because you gave it to yourself, you found it in yourself. We're faced with a society where that doesn't show up very often because it can't, because we have to redress the balance. Your early story has so much to do with you, Mama Nasra, others finding the grand midwives, interviewing the grand midwives, sitting at the feet of the grand midwives, taking what they had to pass down and accepting it and moving it through in your work. These ways of being are lost. And we're in the middle of the reaping of what has been sowed. You mentioned seeds earlier. And you mentioned that, we are in this stage, especially as the remaining elders in the Black midwife community, at least, before, we all are gone, we need to be able to know that the upcoming midwives are going to be able to prevail. I think since time began, I mean, every story somewhere along the line speaks about the power of the midwives, the necessity of the midwives, the independence of the midwives. Just, midwives are intricately interwoven with history, with culture, with reality, except here. I call my podcast the Perinatal Pause because sometimes you feel like you just have to stop and take a breath.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Sometimes it feels like as we're taking a step forward, they're taking 2 and 3 steps ahead of us to try to, I think what they're trying to do is eventually normalize institutional birth to the point where even C-sections will become the norm. It might become like Brazil, where 90% of women deliver by C-section. That's all they know. And for them, that's the norm, for them. And that's the reason why I'm really glad that we have some sisters and more people are taking midwives out of this country to other countries.
That's right.
You know, to retrain them, because some of them, the whole colonization of midwifery, trickled down over there as well. I'm talking about
Yes.
West Indies, the continent, all,
I was just in Ecuador, where the ancestral midwives literally are trying to be erased. There are no professional midwives, hospital midwives. There's obstetricians and nurses, and the traditional midwives are being persecuted and are, threatened with jail.
Yeah.
It's just, you can't believe that that's going on in this day and age, but it is. And so there's so much out there that on a global space where we have many, opportunities not only to learn and share, but also to organize and champion. The traditional midwifery has held most of these societies for millennia and continues because it's people there. That's how we know, right? Like whatever it is that they do, they're doing it right. Because communities after communities are being supported and delivered by midwives who are handing on their knowledge, handing over their knowledge, and making sure that they don't lose those ancestral ways of being. Do you think in the United States we can help and reclaim the sacredness of birth, help and reclaim this workforce? You mentioned earlier about marrying East and West. In which ways do you think we can try to support the current ways of becoming a midwife to the best empowerment that they can have inside of those ways by reminding each other about the sacredness of birth, holding some of these practices that may not be written into somebody's curriculum. What are your thoughts on how we do this next piece of work?
So, there's schools now, such as your school. There's schools that are available to women who want to preserve or come into midwifery. There's also schools that, and okay, let me back up. There are MEEK accredited schools that are now here,
Mhm.
where they weren't here when I first started. But then there's other programs and schools that are available as well. I think that the next coming midwives, traditional midwives, they don't have to reinvent the wheel.
That's right.
We've already done that for them.
Mhm.
I also believe that at some point, out like here in Georgia, we're not a licensed state. The states that surround Georgia, all the states that surround Georgia are.
Mhm.
And I think that it's inevitable that it will happen, but sometimes it just makes me really wonder because Georgia, that whole good old boy concept, that system is really tight here. But I just want to answer your question that you were asking before and then tie it into this. I think that it's still important for women to learn. You got to learn to hold on to the sacredness and the traditions is important to learn those things, but it's also to learn the things that education has made available for us
Right.
today. You
Yes.
know,
The
there's things that
competencies.
Yes, the
Mhm.
things that we know now that maybe Miss Arilla Smiley wasn't exposed to
That's
back in
right.
the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And these are things that you need to know in order to offer holistic, healthy, safe continuity of care. But you got to learn it, okay?
Right.
I'm not a believer of one that just gave birth to a baby and now I did it and I know how to do it. And now I'm going to wear the midwife badge. You've got to learn. And that's why I was saying that whole process of being patient. It doesn't have to be 4 years, it could be 7 years. It can be 10 years. I have one student who's with me now who's been on this past path of learning for 20 years,
Yes.
but she's had some life interruptions, but she has maintained it. And so being patient is really important, knowing our history. Now, I don't know, I haven't looked at your curriculum to say whether you have this in your curriculum or not. And I don't know if they're in other schools' curriculums too. But one way of answering your question is making history, the history of midwifery and childbirth in America, as one of the core classes that you
Yes.
have to take.
That's the first class. It's part of the first semester. The other
Yeah.
class that we have, it's part of our first semester in our school, is that you're going to be trained as a community health worker in that first semester. You will
Mm-hmm.
then leave our school with two certifications:
Mm-hmm.
community health worker, community midwife,
Mm-hmm.
together, because we are clear that our midwifery program is getting students into a community space so that they are able to manage all aspects of that, from the public health aspect, from the organizing aspect, from the understanding policy, from research. The whole cross section of community health is part of, in our world and in our belief, essential when you put the history in front of these women, these students. When you are placing that history at the beginning, then you give them some tools with which to work alongside of that, against that, or with that accordingly. And I think that is definitely one of the areas where we're hoping to build in resilience ahead of time before they even are out the gate. Because
Yeah,
you understand history, it's like the Sankofa. You look back to learn what to do going forward.
that's right. And so, I'm hoping that the concept of functional or integrative medicine flourishes throughout this land. I'm hoping with the new generations of doctors that are coming into practice will take on integrative medicine as their practice. Morehouse School of Medicine, I couldn't stay in the pilot program, but I'm trying to get in the first one. But they had a pilot program that they offered this winter, like this past winter. It was a traditional medicine program. And
Yeah.
what they were doing was they were showing how communities in Cuba, certain parts of Africa, and China, and they were showing this program shows you how you can create a healthcare system where as addressing everybody is addressing the needs of people from the traditional level to the medical level, through the this, that, and where all their needs are being met. And that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that this becomes a program that more students at Morehouse can get into. And then as they graduate, then they implement these type of practices, whether I'm still here or still practicing or not.
That's
And
right.
so I want the students to continue going to school because there is a future for them.
Right.
There is a future that's waiting for them. And so they should use this time now to get all their ducks in the row, get all their education, and see where it's going to take them because they might be able to see where. I mean, this program is also showing, Jenny, how integrative medicine also included the spiritual workers, the voodoo
That's right.
workers,
The
the
healers.
medicine man, the healers in the
Yes,
community. They all work together. Why not?
exactly.
Everybody does not need to have a baby in the hospital, just like everybody doesn't need to have their baby at home either.
That's
You
right.
know, the hospital should be set aside for those who really need it and really want it, and then the home birth should be set aside for those who really want it and they're low risk.
That's right.
And then that midwife who's serving this mother can have we need to have not only is it integrative care, but we need to have respectful care. There's nothing worse than you as a midwife knowing that this mother needs to go to the hospital because of this reason, and we need to get there now. And then you go to the hospital, and then so much time is spent, asking questions. Let me do her blood pressure. And they're not getting at this mother because you're feeling apprehensive about saying, I was planning a home birth, and this is the reason why we're here. Is it because she's going to get scorned faces? Am
Mhm.
I going to get my name tossed to the nursing board or the mail? We don't need that. We need properly educated and trained midwives who know what they're doing, who are competent, who know how to make critical decisions, who know when it's time to go to the hospital, who can take these records to the hospital and say, this is how her labor has been going. This is the reason why we're here today. Pass the baton on and and it be seamless like that. That's what we need.
And you just gave a brilliant explanation and description of what is the same situation across the rest of the entire world. Midwifery is not a standalone profession. Midwifery is part of a collaborative team. And
Mm.
I've never been anywhere, and I've been a lot of places, but these United States, with the absolute wanton disregard for collaborative models, for willingness to acknowledge and to support outside providers in any safe way, for fear, basically, for litigation, for capitalism, for whatever is driving that has been the death knell, literally, for so many mothers and babies in this country. It is the lack of that collaborative care that you so beautifully described that has caused so many of these harms. It is the root cause in many instances for the morbidity and mortality.
Look at all my babies. That was a clear example of team.
Yes,
You had Miss Margaret Smith, who was the midwife. If she got the green card from the clients, meaning that they were low risk and they can have their baby at home, that was good. She went with them to the clinics where the doctors or the nurses gave them their prenatal care. Mother went back home and had her baby at home with the midwife. That's what I'm talking about.
and that's standard everywhere else, believe me. There isn't a place that I can think of where the midwife is ostracized from being in the hospital environment when there's a need, or that the physicians and the nurses are, unwilling to support the transports and the referrals. This is where we literally stand out. And again, here's another correlation as to why we are dead last in maternal health and mortality in the USA, amongst countries with all the resources they could possibly need for safe maternity care. There's no other reason why our numbers are so abysmal and continuously so. There's absolutely no reason why our numbers are worsening. It's not a shortage of money. It's not a shortage of spaces and professionals. Yes, I know we could do better. We could do some better numbers, but no, this is built on institutional and structural built-in harms and ways of being, which are based on racism, based on classism, deep discrimination.
And
And
it has created a ripple effect as well. Whereas once upon a time, your mother was the one that taught you things that you need to know about your pregnancy and preparing for childbirth. Well, now you have a couple of generations or 3 generations of our foremothers that did get caught up in that moment, in that
yes,
time period, that had their babies in the hospital, who can't describe to their daughters how to get through labor because a lot of them were under twilight
right?
or saddle blocks, and
Yes,
today with epidurals,
yes,
and then the whole wisdom, that whole mother wisdom that would be passed on from mother to daughter, from auntie to niece, the church women to the young pregnant, that whole mother wit has faded. And
yes,
what we're trying to do is we're trying to catch up. Our generation, we're trying to catch up, bring everybody up at least 50 or 60 years that got lost in where before you didn't need nobody, you didn't need no lactation specialist to teach you how to breastfeed, man. You're breastfeeding Mr.'s wife's babies, you know? But
yes,
that whole dismantling of
yes,
that culture, our culture of birth, also created that, because in that same time period, now they were encouraging women to bottle feed their babies,
that's right.
and so they would give them medicine that they need to suppress their milk. They would
Mhm.
have the formulas. 6 weeks later, their periods will come back. Then you get on birth control, and then you have that whole cycle that just
Yes.
repeats itself. And so what we're doing is that we're playing catch up. All these lactation specialists are getting their LSCs and all those other degrees and whatnot, are playing catch up from what our grandmothers and our mothers used to once teach us, you know.
Yes. Hold that thought. Let me get this dog. Come here, you. She's going to start barking at my podcast.
You still have your doggy? Hey there,
She's
Poochie,
such a, she's got to be in the middle of everything. All right. Let's get back here. So, Sarahn, if you could leave a blessing, a prayer, like a piece of wisdom for the midwives that are soon to be born into midwifery, or to already on the journey, halfway through and despairing, burned out, wondering if they should quit, what would your words of wisdom be to those people who are on the path? Have you got anything you want to share for them, with them? Words of encouragement. What would you say to those midwives or soon to be midwives?
Well, like I said before, find somebody or someplace that you can learn from. You know, people once would apprentice with somebody. Now you can go to school and do clinicals and do apprenticeships. You know, learn as much as you can learn. Don't ever feel like you've learned it all, because it's like Salama says, as soon as you feel like you know it all, you've learned it all, that's when you become dangerous.
That's
You
right.
know, you continue to learn. Always look at yourself as a steward, okay? Because we are also doing God's work. You may be paying your bills with it, but we're also doing God's work. I mean, we're helping to bring life, we're ushering life here. And so we're kind of like shepherds. And a shepherd's responsibility is to make sure that his flock is staying on the straight and narrow to get to the other side. And as soon as you see a sheep straying away, you get your staff and you bring them back, okay? Our mothers need a lot of education on nutrition, okay? Because some of those things that are on that maternal mortality list are derived from lifestyle. And a lot of that lifestyle is based on diet and nutrition. We have to teach mothers, and you learn, okay? Learn. It makes me mad sometimes. I have some new students that laugh about with our patients about eating honey buns. Don't talk about honey buns in my office, okay? When we come into my office, we're talking about fruits and vegetables. We're
Right.
talking about grass-fed meats. You know, if you're eating meat, we're talking about herbs. We're talking about walking. We're talking about keeping them on this path. Okay, because those other things, that's what causes them to stray away. But you have to be also a living example.
That's
You
right.
know, you have to walk your talk. Otherwise, you're being hypocritical.
And we have to take care of ourselves. We
Mhm.
really do not do a good job. And the burnout is real. The struggle is real.
It
And
is.
mhm,
Those women I know that got busy practices, those women I know that have gotten into these doula programs where they're in the hospitals and they're ripping and running to births every day, all day long, only to find out 6 months later you're burnt out. It wasn't intended on being that. It was intended to be a sacred, empowering, loving, safe experience for the mother and baby and for you. Because if you're not taking care of yourself, then how are you going to take care of somebody else?
well, thank you so much, Elder Midwife Mama Sarahn, for pausing with us and sharing your sacred story, sharing your wisdom, sharing the history that we are so hungry to learn. May your hands, your heart, and your history continue to guide us. This has been a moment of remembering, of resting and reclaiming with the Perinatal Pause podcast and the hands that caught us. Thank you for being with me today. I so appreciate you. Love you.
Well, thank you. Thank you from coming across the pond here to the United States and erect our very first Black midwifery school. Lord knows we need you. Jennie had published this book about 20 years ago. It was a Black book with the image of a
Yep.
Black woman on there.
It's called Beautiful
Beautiful.
Images of Health, Joy, and Vitality in Pregnancy and Birth. And
Yeah.
it was 2007 that I did.
Uh-huh.
And I did that because I had not seen and didn't know why I couldn't find positive images of Black women anywhere,
Yes.
pregnant
Yes.
women.
And so that I'm glad that the Creator has blessed you with the wherewithals to do everything that it is that you're doing. You know, you're expanding midwifery on a national, perhaps even on on a global level as well. I'm holding it down here on the ground level, here in Georgia. And I think that we are doing good work, and God has promised, God is written in the Bible. We be midwives and we'll be blessed,
Right.
with home. And so thank you. And it's kind of funny, Jennie. You're asking me this question. I remember when I was the young midwife sitting at the feet of the grand midwives, and now it's full circle
Full
now,
circle. Full circle.
These young folks are, sitting at our feet now. I remember when I first started, the moms that would come to their daughter's births would look at me like I'm some young person, like, what do I know? And
Right.
now I go to births and some of the grandmothers are younger than I am now.
This is so true.
And so time goes by fast. I don't want the student midwives to take forever and ever, because time does not stand still. If you feel like you have a gift to offer to the world, go ahead and seek it.
Yes.
Perseverance pays off. And to the other midwives of my generation who are passing the torch on, bravo to us that's raised. It's important for us that as we pass the baton on, that we are making sure that these women are standing on our shoulders, and shoulders that are solid,
Yes.
so
Yes.
that they will take on, and they will probably learn more than what we learn, as because each generation learns on more things, and they will pass that knowledge on to the next person. I do believe that we need to repopulate the numbers of Black and Brown and Indigenous midwives. Don't be afraid to meet other Black and Brown and Indigenous midwives and learn their cultures, their birthing cultures, their pregnancy, their midwifery cultures and traditions. And if it makes sense to you, incorporate it. And that's how you keep it. That's how you keep midwifery's breath breathing,
And it's always been done that way.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.